Ancient Rome wasn't all glory and gladiators. It was a nightmare if you got on the wrong side of the law. They didn't just execute people, they invented pain. From molten metal down the throat to being eaten alive by beasts in front of a cheering crowd. Every punishment was designed to make you a legend of suffering. But here's the thing. Most of these weren't quick or clean. Some were so insane that even Roman soldiers looked away. So let's go through 100 of the worst, most twisted ways to die in ancient Rome. And trust me, by the end of this list, you'll be grateful for modern laws. First, crucifixion. Imagine hanging from a cross for hours, or even days, while your own body slowly suffocates you. That was Roman crucifixion, a punishment designed not just to kill, but to humiliate. Nails were hammered through wrists and ankles, and as the victim hung, breathing became a battle. The pain was constant, every breath a scream. Sometimes soldiers broke the legs to speed up death. Other times they left you to rot under the burning sun. It was slow, public, and unforgettable. The Roman Empire's ultimate warning. Defy us and die in agony. 2. Scaphism. A Persian horror adopted by the Romans, Scaphism was cruelty in slow motion. The victim was trapped between two hollowed-out logs, with their head, hands, and feet sticking out. Then came the honey and milk, force-fed until diarrhea filled the boats. More honey was smeared on the exposed skin to attract insects. Flies, wasps, and worms devoured the body over several days. You didn't burn or bleed, you decayed alive, becoming a feast for thousands of crawling mouths under the unforgiving sun. 3. Poena Cullei. Rome had a unique punishment for killing your parents. Poena Cullei, the punishment of the sack. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack alongside a monkey, a snake, and a rooster, all alive and furious. Then the sack was thrown into a river. Inside, chaos exploded, biting, scratching, strangling. The Romans believed even the gods should never see such a soul again. It wasn't just death by drowning. It was a frantic, animal-filled nightmare sealed in darkness. 4. Burned alive. When the Romans burned you, it wasn't instant. It was a message. They tied victims to stakes, coated them in pitch or oil, and set them ablaze before a crowd. Flames ate through skin and nerves, turning screams into raw smoke. Sometimes they used burning as light for parties, like Emperor Nero did. Humans as torches to illuminate his gardens. Fire was purifying, they said. But in truth, it was the empire's cruelest spectacle of power and punishment. 5. Beheaded by axe. Quick? Maybe. Clean? Rarely. Beheading in Rome was meant for citizens, an honorable death compared to crucifixion. But a dull blade or shaky executioner could turn mercy into horror. One bad swing and you'd be half-conscious, choking on blood, waiting for the next blow. The crowd watched for precision. The executioner prayed for it. If he failed, you didn't die instantly. You bled out, eyes open, realizing the empire still found a way to make even mercy cruel. 6. Fed to lions. The Colosseum wasn't just entertainment. It was a feeding ground. Criminals, rebels, and Christians were tossed into the arena with starved lions, tigers, or bears. The crowd cheered, emperors smiled, and the condemned faced teeth and claws with nowhere to run. The lions didn't kill quickly. They mauled, ripped, and toyed with their prey. Sometimes they dragged victims around before tearing them apart. The blood-soaked sand was cleaned for the next show. Rome called it justice. History calls it horror. 7. Buried alive. For the Romans, being buried alive wasn't just death. It was disgrace. Vestal virgins who broke their vows were sealed in underground chambers with a single lamp and a bit of food. When the oil ran out, darkness took over. You suffocated slowly, surrounded by earth and silence, knowing no one would ever dig you out. Soldiers, too, could face this fate for cowardice. The ground became your tomb, and your punishment was to feel every moment of it. 8. Boiled in oil. When Rome wanted to make an example, fire and oil did the job. Victims were lowered into massive cauldrons of boiling oil, water, or pitch. The skin blistered, peeled, and cooked before the heart even stopped. The pain was total, flesh melting, lungs filling with steam, screams rising with the bubbles. It wasn't a fast death. It was slow, theatrical, and unforgettable. The Romans didn't just kill, they perfected the art of making agony public. 9. Quartered by horses. Imagine being tied by your limbs to 4 powerful horses, each facing a different direction. At the signal, they gallop. Your arms and legs wrench apart, tendons snap, bones splinter, and the body tears open at the center. It wasn't a common Roman method, but it appeared in later imperial punishments for traitors. The goal wasn't execution. It was dismemberment so violent that no grave could contain what was left. A brutal end for those who defied the state. 10. Impaled. Impaling was the empire's slowest kind of death. A sharpened stake was forced through the body, sometimes through the abdomen, sometimes the rear, and set upright so gravity did the rest. Victims could live for hours, even days, as the pole slid deeper with every movement. Their screams echoed through the city, warning others. It wasn't just punishment, it was terror sculpted in flesh. Rome used it rarely, but when they did, no one forgot. 11. Gladiator Death. The Colosseum was Rome's heartbeat and its cruelty. Gladiators fought to entertain the masses, not always to the death, but enough to make every match a gamble. A single wound could mean infection, disembowelment, or mercy at the whim of the crowd. Thumbs up didn't always mean life. It meant the emperor chose spectacle over mercy. Some fought beasts, others each other. Under the roar of 50,000 Romans, every drop of blood became applause. Glory or death, it was all the same to Rome. 12. Thrown off the Tarpeian rock. On the edge of Rome's Capitoline Hill stood the Tarpeian Rock, a sheer drop reserved for traitors and murderers. Bound and beaten, the condemned were hurled over the cliff to crash on the stones below. Bones shattered, skulls split, and sometimes the body rolled into the Tiber. Crowds gathered to watch, not for pity, but for justice served by gravity. It was simple, brutal, and final. Rome's way of saying betrayal deserved no burial, only the fall. 13. Starved in a cell. Some weren't executed by blade or beast. They were just forgotten. Locked in a dark cell, denied food and light, prisoners starved over weeks. The hunger twisted their minds before their bodies failed. Some tried to eat leather straps or straw. Others drank their own urine to survive. The Romans didn't waste effort. They let nature handle the punishment. Death came quietly, bones against stone, a slow fade into nothingness where even rats stopped visiting. 14. Flayed Alive. Few deaths matched the horror of flaying. The executioner's knife sliced through the skin, peeling it away inch by inch. The pain was beyond screaming. Nerve endings lit up like fire. Sometimes the skin was nailed to walls as a warning. The victim left alive just long enough to see it happen. Though rare, Rome reserved this torment for the worst offenders, traitors, rebels, and spies. And you didn't just die, you became a message carved into your own flesh. 15. Strangled by executioners. Strangulation was considered merciful compared to fire or crucifixion, but that didn't make it kind. The condemned were tied to a post, and a cord or garrote was wrapped around their neck. 2 men pulled from behind until the air was gone. Sometimes it took seconds, sometimes minutes. In prison, nobles often faced this fate quietly, out of sight. It was the Roman way of saying, "You're not worth a blade." No glory, no spectacle, just silence. 16. Forced to drink molten gold. When the Romans wanted irony, they used molten gold. This punishment was often reserved for corrupt officials or greedy nobles. The victim was restrained while soldiers heated gold until it liquefied, then poured it down the throat through a funnel. The metal seared flesh instantly, boiling the tongue and throat, bursting the stomach from the inside. Death came fast, but not mercifully. It was a lesson written in Parni. If gold was your god, then gold would be your grave. 17. Torn apart by dogs. One of the Empire's cruelest public executions involved packs of trained war dogs. The condemned, often slaves or rebels, were stripped naked, chained, and thrown into an enclosure. The dogs were starved for days before release. They didn't just kill, they tore. Flesh, bone, and tendon were shredded while crowds shouted approval. This punishment was both entertainment and warning. When Rome wanted to remind its people who ruled, it unleashed the very beasts it had trained for war. 18. Trampled by elephants. Borrowed from Eastern kingdoms, execution by elephant was brutal and theatrical. The condemned were laid on the ground as war elephants were commanded to step forward, slowly. Sometimes the animal crushed the head for instant death. Other times it started with limbs, breaking bones one by one. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the victim was flattened into the dust. It wasn't just execution, it was domination, a display of imperial power and absolute control. 19. Beaten to death with clubs. Before the axe or the cross, the club did the work. Soldiers carried bundles of rods and axes called fasces, the symbol of authority. When ordered, they used those rods to beat the condemned until bones broke and skin tore. It was a common punishment for deserters, thieves, or rioters. Some died instantly, others lingered for hours. Each strike wasn't just pain, it was Rome's law made flesh. The sound of the blows was as much a warning as the sight. 20. Drowned in sewage. Death didn't always come from glory or spectacle. Some were thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's massive sewage system. Bound in chains, they were tossed into the foul current to drown in filth. The stench, the darkness, and the choking sludge made it one of the most humiliating ends possible. For the Romans, this was reserved for the truly despised. Traitors, blasphemers, or corrupt officials. You didn't just die, you vanished beneath the waste of the empire you served. 21. Exposed to the elements. Sometimes, the Romans didn't kill you directly. They just let nature do it. The condemned were stripped naked and tied to a post or tree outside the city walls. The sun blistered the skin by day. The cold froze the body by night, and hunger gnawed until nothing was left but bone. Wild animals or scavengers often finished the job. It wasn't about blood, it was about abandonment. The Empire didn't even give you a blade or fire, just time and suffering. 22. Death by gladiatrix. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, were rare, but their fights were brutal. When sentenced to die by their hands, victims faced both humiliation and horror. Rome loved the spectacle of reversal, men cut down by women in the sand. The crowd howled as blades flashed, blood sprayed, and the condemned begged for mercy that never came. It wasn't just execution, it was theater, a deliberate mockery of masculinity and rebellion. In Rome, even death could be staged as irony. 23. Sawn in half. Few tortures were as ghastly as being sawn alive. The victim was hung upside down so the blood rushed to the head, keeping them conscious longer. Then the executioner began cutting from the groin downward. The saw passed through bone and flesh, slowly, methodically, while screams filled the air. The crowd could see the pain in every motion. The Romans reserved this horror for the worst criminals, those whose death had to be remembered, not just witnessed. 24. Poisoned by hemlock. When nobles had to die, Rome preferred elegance over spectacle. Hemlock, a potent plant poison, was the weapon of choice. The condemned drank it in a calm, formal ritual. Within minutes, numbness crawled up from the feet, freezing the body as the mind stayed aware. The heart slowed until it simply stopped. It was dignified, even philosophical, used famously by thinkers like Socrates. But make no mistake, beneath the calm, it was still a slow, paralyzing death in silence. 25. Tortured by the rack. The rack stretched the human body to its breaking point. The victim was tied by wrists and ankles, and soldiers turned wheels that pulled the ropes tighter each time. Joints popped, tendons snapped, and screams echoed through stone chambers. Sometimes they stopped before death, leaving the victim crippled. Other times they didn't stop at all. Rome used it to extract confessions or to entertain the powerful. It was a mechanical masterpiece of pain, built to unmake the human body. 26. Crushed by stones. Sometimes the Romans didn't swing a sword. They let weight do the killing. The condemned was forced to lie flat while soldiers stacked heavy stones or slabs on their chest, one by one. Breathing grew harder with every addition until ribs cracked and lungs collapsed. It could take minutes or hours. The victim's final sound wasn't a scream. It was a faint gasp crushed under silence. The Romans called it efficient. To everyone else, it was slow-motion suffocation under empire's weight. 27. Executed in the arena. The arena was Rome's grand stage for death. Condemned criminals, called noxi, were thrown into the Colosseum unarmed to face trained fighters or wild beasts. Lions, leopards, even bears were set loose as the crowd roared. There was no chance of survival. It was punishment disguised as entertainment. Some were forced to reenact myths, dying in character as the gods watched. The sand turned red, the crowd cheered, and when it was over, the empire's thirst for blood was briefly satisfied. 28. Boiled in tar. For traitors, spies, and conspirators, Rome had a recipe for horror: tar, boiling, and black. Victims were submerged slowly, skin blistering instantly, eyes swelling, lungs filling with the thick fumes. The tar stuck to the flesh like fire that refused to let go. By the time the body sank, it was already unrecognizable, melted, charred, erased. To the Romans, this wasn't overkill. It was symbolism. Betray the empire, and the empire would burn you until your very identity was gone. 29. Thrown into the Tiber. The Tiber River, the lifeblood of Rome, was also its silent executioner. Those condemned were bound in chains, sometimes with weights tied to their necks, and thrown from bridges or riverbanks. The splash marked the end. No ceremony, no trial, just disappearance. The current carried bodies away, washing Rome's sins downstream. It was practical, efficient, and absolute. The river took everything: breath, sound, dignity. To die in the Tiber meant you didn't even deserve a grave. 30. Eaten by rats. When the Romans wanted to torture slowly, they turned to nature's filthiest executioners. The condemned was restrained as a cage full of rats was placed on the stomach. Then a hot plate was set on top, forcing the rats to dig their way down to escape the heat. Flesh tore, blood sprayed, and panic filled the air. The screams came long before death. It wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare. The Romans understood one thing well: fear lasts longer than pain. 31. Tied to a stake and shot with arrows. Slow and theatrical. In Rome, execution wasn't just punishment, it was performance. Victims were tied upright to a wooden stake, arms spread wide and used as living targets. Archers didn't aim for the heart right away. They struck the limbs first, prolonging the agony for minutes, even hours. Each arrow drew applause as blood painted the sand. The final shot, usually to the chest or throat, ended the torment in front of cheering spectators. It wasn't justice. It was a live horror show dressed as Roman order. 32. buried under rubble, collapsed buildings during games or punishments. Being buried alive wasn't just a natural disaster, it was sometimes planned. In certain Roman games or punishments, prisoners or slaves were placed beneath unstable scaffolds or walls that were intentionally collapsed for dramatic effect. Imagine the deafening crack of marble and dust as tons of stone came crashing down. The victims suffocated slowly under the rubble. No rescue, no mercy, just the slow crush of weight and silence. To the Roman crowd, it symbolized the god's judgment, swift, heavy, and final. 33. Thrown to wild boars. Savage deaths in mock hunts. While lions and tigers get all the fame, wild boars were equally lethal in Roman arenas. Armed only with a small shield or nothing at all, a condemned man was thrown into the arena with one or more enraged boars. Creatures known to rip open soldiers in seconds. The boar's tusks could disembowel a man with one charge, and the screams echoed through the Colosseum as the audience roared with excitement. It wasn't a fight. It was a feeding frenzy, a spectacle of pain disguised as entertainment. 34. Death by scorpion pit. Venomous insects used for torture. Scorpions were small, silent, and sadistic tools of Roman torture. Some records describe pits or boxes filled with hundreds of these venomous creatures into which prisoners were thrown. Every sting burned like fire under the skin, spreading waves of pain through the nervous system. Victims often convulsed and screamed uncontrollably as paralysis or heart failure set in. There was no escape, just a creeping, agonizing end, surrounded by crawling death. For the Romans, it was both punishment and warning. Defy the empire, and suffer nature's cruelty magnified by man. 35. Stabbed 23 times, like Caesar, betrayed and butchered by friends. Perhaps the most famous Roman death of all, Julius Caesar's. On March 15th, 44 BCE, he walked into the Senate expecting loyalty, only to meet betrayal. Surrounded by men he trusted, Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Each thrust wasn't just steel, it was treachery. The most haunting detail? He didn't fight back after recognizing Brutus, his closest ally. Et tu, Brute, became the ultimate symbol of betrayal. His blood soaked the marble floor of the Senate, and the Republic fell with him. It wasn't execution by law, it was murder by ambition. 36. Flogged until death. Endless lashes, until the body collapsed. In ancient Rome, flogging wasn't just punishment, it was a sentence of destruction. Victims were stripped naked, tied to a post, and beaten with whips made of leather thongs tipped with bone or metal. Each lash tore through skin, muscles, and nerves until the body became a mangled map of agony. Blood spattered the ground, and the sound of each crack echoed like thunder in the forum. The Romans called it flagellation, but when it didn't stop, it became an execution. Death came slowly, first from shock, then from blood loss or infection. To the crowd, it was justice. To the condemned, it was an eternity of pain. 37. Death by boiling wine, a cruel imperial punishment. Some Roman emperors, like the infamous Elagabalus, turned execution into twisted art. One such horror was death by boiling wine. The condemned were bound and submerged into massive vats of wine, heated over fire until it bubbled like lava. At first, the victim's screams mixed with the hiss of boiling liquid, the alcohol burning through flesh and lungs with every breath. It was meant to be poetic, death in something once seen as luxury and joy. But the heat, the steam, and the suffocating pain made it one of the cruelest forms of imperial vengeance ever recorded. 38. Run over by a chariot. Crushed in the circus. In the roaring chaos of the Circus Maximus, a place of cheers and blood, chariots weren't always for glory. Sometimes they were instruments of death. Condemned criminals or disgraced soldiers were thrown onto the track during races. The charioteers, urged on by the crowd, drove full speed ahead, iron-rimmed wheels slicing flesh and bone. The victims were trampled, dragged, and left mangled beneath the hooves of horses. The crowd's cheers drowned their screams, and the sand drank the blood of the condemned. To Rome it was sport. To the fallen it was obliteration. 39. Torn apart by hooks. Flesh ripped off as a spectacle. One of the most gruesome Roman methods involved iron hooks, hooks of death. Prisoners were tied or hung, and massive iron hooks were driven into their flesh, shoulders, ribs, or thighs. Then, executioners pulled. Sometimes it was done by hand, sometimes attached to pulleys or animals. The skin tore, muscles ripped, and the body was literally disassembled piece by piece. This method, called excruciation, was designed to make the victim's agony a public warning. Every scream, every drop of blood reminded the crowd of Rome's absolute power and how cruelly it could enforce it. 40. Hanged from the city walls. Shameful public display. In Rome, hanging wasn't just about death. It was about disgrace. To be hanged from the city walls meant you were denied honor, family burial, and dignity. The condemned were hoisted up high, visible to everyone entering the city, their bodies twisted in the wind, sometimes left there for days, rotting under the sun. Birds pecked at the eyes, insects burrowed into the skin, and the stench filled the air. It wasn't the rope that killed the soul, it was the shame. Rome made sure even in death your punishment continued, visible to all who dared defy the empire. 41. Exiled and left to starve. Slow death in isolation. In ancient Rome, exile could be a death sentence disguised as mercy. The condemned were stripped of citizenship, wealth, and rights, banished to barren islands or remote deserts where survival was impossible. No food, no allies, no hope. Hunger gnawed day by day, and madness crept in as the body weakened. Some tried to fish, others drank salt water in desperation, but death always came, quiet and pitiless. Rome saw it as lenient, but in truth it was a slower, lonelier execution. The empire didn't need to lift a sword. Isolation did the killing for them. 42. Devoured by wolves, a grim fate outside city limits. Being thrown to wolves wasn't common, but it was unforgettable. Criminals, deserters, or outcasts were sometimes cast beyond the city's protection, where packs of wolves roamed the dark countryside. Once the animals caught the scent, the hunt began. There was no escape. Their glowing eyes and snarls surrounded the victim before the tearing started. Flesh ripped from bone, screams drowned by growls. To Romans, this was poetic justice, the wild reclaiming those who defied civilization. To the condemned, it was nature's revenge, brutal, primal, and without mercy. 43. Tossed into a volcano. Mythic. Said to appease the gods. Though more myth than routine punishment, stories of Romans, or those before them, being sacrificed to volcanoes captured the imagination. In some tales, condemned criminals were thrown into the fiery mouth of Mount Etna or Vesuvius to calm the gods' anger. Imagine the terror. Heat so intense it scorched the lungs before the body even touched the molten rock. Whether myth or ritualized fear, it symbolized ultimate purification, soul consumed by flame, body erased by the earth itself. In Rome's eyes, even nature could be a courtroom, and fire its final judge. 44. Suffocated in ashes, a real punishment for temple robbers. For those who robbed temples or defied sacred law, Rome reserved a punishment as poetic as it was horrific. Suffocation in ashes. Victims were sealed in a chamber filled with fine, choking ash, sometimes mixed with soot or dust. Each breath filled the lungs with grit, and the more they struggled, the faster they suffocated. The ashes symbolized divine wrath, soft, silent, and absolute. It wasn't quick, Death crept slowly as the victim's gasps turned to silence. Rome called it justice by the god's hand. To the victim, it was like drowning on land. 45. Crushed by a millstone. Slow, grinding execution. The Romans turned even simple tools of labor into instruments of death. A millstone, used to grind grain, could also grind flesh. The condemned were tied beneath or beside it as it turned, pulled by donkeys or slaves. Bones cracked, ribs splintered, and organs burst as the stone rolled on, grinding the body bit by bit. Sometimes the stone was dropped directly onto the victim's chest, slowly suffocating them under its weight. It was punishment and symbolism combined, turning human life into dust beneath the same stone that fed Rome's people. 46. Death in the mines. Slaves worked to exhaustion and collapse. The Roman mines were hell carved into the earth. Deep tunnels filled with choking dust. Darkness and toxic air became the final resting place for countless slaves and prisoners. Those sent there weren't expected to return. They dug until their bodies broke. The heat, lack of oxygen, and collapsing shafts killed slowly. But the true torture was exhaustion. Many died still gripping their tools, collapsing mid-swing. To Rome, the mines were a punishment worse than death. No audience, no escape, just endless labor until the body gave up. The empire took their strength, their lives, and finally their breath. 47. Thrown to Eels, used in luxurious villas as pawns. Among Rome's elite, cruelty could be creative. Wealthy nobles kept moray eels in garden ponds, feeding them scraps or condemned slaves. The story goes that a cruel patrician once tossed a servant who broke a goblet into the eel pond as punishment. The eels, starved for days, tore into the flesh like knives. The water churned red as the victim screamed and vanished beneath the surface. It wasn't just execution. It was a spectacle of decadence. For the Romans, it showed the power of wealth. For the victim, it was death by luxury turned monstrous. 48. Tortured on the wheel, limbs broken, body twisted. The breaking wheel, or rota, was Rome's rotating nightmare. Victims were tied across a large wooden wheel, and executioners methodically smashed their limbs with iron hammers. Bones splintered, joints popped, and the body twisted unnaturally. Once broken, the mangled figure was left on display, alive, sometimes for hours, even days. Crows pecked at the flesh while the crowd gawked at the slow descent into death. It wasn't just torture, it was theater. Rome turned human suffering into public art, painting agony across wood and sky for all to see. 49. Skinned and salted. Flesh peeled and salted to prolong agony. Few punishments embodied pure sadism like being skinned alive. In rare but recorded cases, traitors or enemies of the state were stripped of their skin layer by layer, each slice revealing raw, exposed nerves. Then came the salt, rubbed into wounds to keep the victim conscious, every grain igniting unbearable fire under the flesh. Death didn't come quickly, it lingered. The air, the salt, the pain, all combined into a nightmare beyond screaming. It was a warning to others. Betray Rome, and you'll become your own execution. 50. Tossed in boiling water. For assassins and poisoners. Assassins and poisoners, considered especially deceitful, were punished with boiling water or oil. The condemned were thrown into large cauldrons as the liquid bubbled violently. Skin blistered and peeled instantly, muscles contracted, and lungs filled with steam as they screamed. It was both punishment and purification. The heat meant to cleanse treachery through agony. Spectators claimed the smell of burning flesh was unbearable. But to the Romans, that was the point. The empire ruled through fear, and few things frightened people more than watching a man cook alive in judgment. 51. Devoured by hyenas. Imported for exotic executions. Rome's thirst for spectacle knew no limits. Even nature's predators were imported to feed it. Hyenas brought from Africa were sometimes used in the arenas for exotic punishments. Their eerie laughter echoed as they circled the condemned, tearing at limbs and throats with bone-crushing jaws. The Romans saw it as entertainment, a savage display of nature devouring man. To the audience, it was thrilling. To the victim, it was terror in fur and teeth. The hyena's laughter was the last sound they'd ever hear, a chilling harmony of cruelty and applause. 52. Pierced with spears. Soldiers punished for desertion. Discipline in the Roman army was absolute, and desertion meant death by spear. A line of soldiers formed as the condemned was made to stand defenseless before them. One by one, each soldier thrust his spear into the body, a grim ritual of duty and obedience. Sometimes it was done as fustuarium or decimation, where every 10th man was executed to enforce loyalty. There was no mercy, no hesitation. Blood pooled beneath Roman sandals as comrades killed comrades. It wasn't just punishment, it was a warning carved into flesh. Rome tolerates no weakness. 53. Death by catapult, flung into oblivion as punishment or joke. Romans had a dark sense of humor, and at times that humor was deadly. Some accounts describe prisoners or slaves tied to catapults or ballista and hurled through the air, either as entertainment or mock punishment. The body, launched like a human projectile, would crash into the ground or walls at lethal speed, bones shattering on impact. To the soldiers, it was morbid fun. To the crowd, pure spectacle. The condemned didn't just die, they flew to their deaths, proving once again that Rome could turn even physics into cruelty. 54. Public disembowelment. Guts pulled out for the crowd. In the Roman arena, nothing was too gruesome for the crowd's appetite. Public disembowelment was one of the most horrifying spectacles. The condemned were tied upright while the executioner slit open the abdomen, slowly pulling out the intestines by hand or hook. The crowd watched the body twitch and fade, fascinated by death in motion for traitors and conspirators. It was a way to humiliate, to show that even your insides belonged to Rome. The pain was unimaginable, the death inevitable. Rome didn't just kill its enemies, it displayed their mortality like art. 55. Suffocated in wet leather, tied tight as it shrank. A silent but excruciating Roman execution involved wet leather. The condemned was bound tightly in freshly soaked animal hides. As the leather dried under the heat, it began to shrink, squeezing the body tighter and tighter. Breathing became harder, ribs cracked, and the skin split under pressure. It was death by slow compression, with no weapon needed, just time and heat. The Romans admired its simplicity and cruelty. Nature itself became the executioner. By the time the leather hardened, the body beneath was crushed, contorted, and lifeless. 56. Death by bees, trapped with hives for sting torture. Among Rome's more creative torments was the use of bees. Yes, the buzzing kind. Victims were tied or enclosed in small spaces filled with beehives, then deliberately provoked. The swarm attacked instantly, stinging the exposed skin hundreds of times. Swelling closed the eyes and throat, and every breath burned as venom spread through the body. Sometimes honey was smeared on the skin to lure even more insects. It was a slow, agonizing death, part suffocation, part poison, and entirely humiliating. To Romans, it was a poetic punishment, sweetness turned to agony, nature weaponized by human hands. 57. Executed by slaves. Dishonor through lowly hands. In a world built on hierarchy, Romans valued honor even in death. So when someone of high status was sentenced to die by slaves, it wasn't just an execution, it was degradation. Slaves, considered property, were forced to kill their master or noble captives using crude weapons or tools. The condemned suffered not only physically but socially. Being slain by those beneath you stripped away dignity. The crowd laughed as former servants turned executioners. It was humiliation in its purest form, Rome's way of reminding the elite that power meant nothing once the sentence was passed. 58. Thrown naked into snow. Hypothermia by exposure. For exiled criminals in the cold provinces, exposure was a slow and silent killer. Victims were stripped bare and cast into snow-covered wastelands with no shelter, no fire, and no hope. The body trembled uncontrollably as frostbite crept up from the fingers, turning skin blue, then black. The pain gave way to numbness, then hallucination, and finally, sleep. The deadly calm before hypothermia claimed the last breath. Romans saw it as a natural execution, needing no sword, no blood, just the merciless chill of the gods. Death by cold was quiet, but no less cruel. 59. Death by arson, trapped, burned in their homes. Fire was one of the Romans' deadliest punishments, swift, dramatic, and final. Sometimes enemies of the state or traitors were locked inside their homes, which were then set ablaze by soldiers or mobs. Trapped behind barred doors, the victims inhaled thick smoke as flames devoured everything. Walls cracked, roofs fell, and screams faded under the roar of fire. In Rome's eyes, it was justice through purification, flames consuming corruption. But for those inside, it was terror in its purest form, every breath choking, every heartbeat melting into heat and ash. 60. Locked in a coffin alive. Slow panic and oxygen loss. Buried alive. It's one of humanity's oldest fears, and the Romans knew it well. Some criminals or disgraced citizens were sealed inside wooden coffins, left to die in complete darkness. At first they screamed, pounding the lid, gasping for air. But as the oxygen dwindled, panic gave way to dizziness. Then silence. The mind raced while the lungs begged for breath, until nothing remained but stillness. Some coffins were even displayed before burial, forcing the crowd to listen as the victims' cries faded away. It was punishment by isolation, terror, and time. Death in a box, both literal and symbolic. 61. Death by collapsing tunnel. For rebellious slaves in mines. Rebellion among Rome's mine slaves meant one thing: obliteration. Instead of executing them one by one, overseers often sealed off entire tunnels, trapping workers inside. The supports were knocked down or explosives used to bring the ceiling crashing down. Dust filled the air as darkness swallowed everything. The screams echoed for hours before silence fell. Those buried alive suffocated slowly, surrounded by stone and despair. It was more than execution. It was erasure. Rome didn't just kill rebels, it buried their memory beneath the very earth they were forced to dig. 62. Stabbed by gladiator trainee, used as live training. In the brutal world of the gladiatorial schools, practice often meant death for someone else. Criminals, slaves, or prisoners were used as live training dummies for new recruits learning to fight. Armed with dull or blunted weapons, the trainees practiced strikes and stabs while overseers barked orders. The condemned screamed and bled as each mistake was corrected with another blow. There was no audience, no mercy, just steel and sweat. To Rome, it was efficient. One man trained, another perished. It was death repurposed into education, and pain became the lesson. 63. Torn apart by fishhooks, dragged from inside out. This gruesome punishment was the stuff of nightmares. Victims were pierced with large barbed fishhooks through the mouth, ribs, or even the belly. Then ropes were tied to the hooks and pulled, sometimes by men, sometimes by beasts. Flesh tore open, organs spilled out, and the body split apart under its own weight. The spectacle was horrifying yet mesmerizing to Roman crowds. It symbolized exposure of body and betrayal alike. The condemned were literally ripped apart for their crimes, their agony displayed as proof of Rome's power to destroy from the inside out. 64. Buried with corpses, forced to die among the dead. For those accused of defiling graves or angering the gods, Rome devised a punishment both physical and psychological. The condemned were sealed in crypts or burial pits filled with rotting bodies. The stench, the darkness, the crawling insects. It was a descent into living death. Some suffocated quickly, others went mad from fear and decay before dying of thirst. Being buried with the dead was more than execution. It was spiritual exile. Romans believed the soul could never rest after such a fate. To them, this was divine justice through horror. 65. Executed on stage, actors killed for realism in plays. In Rome's hunger for authenticity, some stage plays ended with real blood. During certain tragedies or mythic reenactments, condemned criminals were forced to play doomed characters, like a king beheaded or a warrior burned. But when the moment came, the weapons weren't fake. The execution was real, performed before a cheering audience that mistook cruelty for art. The line between theater and torture vanished, and death became entertainment. These performances proved one chilling truth about Rome. Even culture could be lethal when soaked in spectacle. 66. Tortured by heated iron, branding and burning alive. In ancient Rome, heated iron wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon of pain and domination. Victims were stripped and pinned down, while glowing hot metal rods or plates were pressed against their skin, leaving the stench of burning flesh in the air. This wasn't quick. The torturers took their time, reheating the iron and searing new patches of skin, sometimes until the victim confessed or died. The Romans believed public agony deterred rebellion, and the sight of flesh melting from bones sent a clear, horrifying message. 67. Hung upside down. Blood rush and suffocation. Being hung upside down sounds almost harmless until you realize how the body reacts. The blood surges to the head, bursting vessels in the eyes and brain. Breathing becomes nearly impossible, and the victim slowly suffocates while fully conscious. Romans used this to punish slaves, traitors, or rebels, even crucifying some upside down for added humiliation. The agony could last for hours, and as death crept closer, the victim's mind would fade under unbearable pressure and pain. It was slow, cruel, and designed to erase dignity entirely. 68. Drowned in wine barrels. Poetic but still horrific. Death by wine sounds like something out of a tragic play, and for some Romans it was. Victims were forced headfirst into large amphorae, or barrels filled with wine. The sweet liquid invaded their lungs, choking them in a slow, gurgling death. Nobles sometimes used this refined punishment, mocking the victim with luxury as they drowned. The irony? Wine, the symbol of celebration and the gods, became a tool of suffocation. As the bubbles stopped rising, the crowd would toast, not in honor, but in cruel satisfaction. 69. Death by beeswax, encased and suffocated. Beeswax, soft and sweet, was turned into a method of execution that mixed beauty with horror. Victims were coated or encased in molten wax, either while alive or after partial torture. As the wax cooled, it hardened into a shell, sealing the body inside. If alive, the victim would suffocate slowly as air ran out, frozen in a death mask of terror. Some accounts suggest wax was used to preserve examples of disobedience, the bodies displayed like statues. In Rome, even elegance could hide barbarity. 70. Cut, open for augury, sacrifice to read omens. Before battles or major decisions, Romans sometimes sought divine insight through augury, reading omens from the entrails of sacrificed beings. While usually animals were used, there were darker times when humans were chosen. The victim was cut open alive, their organs exposed as priests interpreted the god's will through the shape and movement of the entrails. The screams were ignored, considered part of the ritual's energy. To them, life was a message, and tearing it apart was a way to hear the gods speak. 71. Tossed from siege towers, execution by gravity. Siege towers once brought death to cities, but sometimes they became the stage for another kind of death. Princes or traitors were dragged to the very top, forced to look down from the towering structure they'd helped defend or destroy. Then they were thrown. The fall wasn't instant death. Bones shattered first, lungs collapsed next, and silence followed after a final scream. The Romans used this as a message. Defiance falls hard. The crowd below often watched in silence, not from pity, but from the grim understanding that Rome's justice always came from above. 72. Starved with food nearby, psychological torture. Imagine being surrounded by food, bread, fruits, even wine, and not allowed to touch a single bite. The Romans used this as a psychological death sentence. Victims were tied or locked in a cell with food just out of reach, forced to watch it rot as hunger consumed them. Some went mad before dying, trying to gnaw through chains or chew on the stone floor. It wasn't just starvation. It was mockery. A cruel reminder that Rome controlled not only your body, but your every desperate desire to live. 73. Forced combat until exhaustion. No rest, no mercy. Gladiators knew that the arena wasn't always about winning. Sometimes it was about lasting. In forced exhaustion executions, criminals or prisoners were made to fight continuously, wave after wave, until their bodies gave out. No breaks, no mercy, no end. Just a test of how long a human could survive before collapsing in blood and sand. Death came from dehydration, loss of blood, or sheer fatigue. The audience cheered not for skill, but for endurance. Rome didn't just crave victory, it worshipped suffering as a form of entertainment. 74. Eaten by locusts, symbolic punishment. Insects devouring corpses. While not a direct execution, this punishment symbolized divine wrath and utter disgrace. After death, certain criminals, especially those accused of heresy or sacrilege, were left unburied in fields, their corpses exposed. Locusts and other insects would swarm, devouring the remains until nothing but bones were left. To Romans, being denied a proper burial was worse than death itself. The locusts became symbols of shame, cleansing the earth of impurity. It was nature's slow justice, cruel, silent, and absolute. 75. Boiled alive in milk and honey, for poetic irony. Few punishments carried such twisted irony. The victim was placed in a large cauldron or tub filled with milk and honey, ingredients once seen as gifts of the gods. The mixture would be slowly heated until it bubbled, turning sweetness into a weapon. Flesh blistered, lungs filled with steam, and the scent of burning sugar mixed with human agony. It was said to purify sin through pain, a grotesque parody of cleansing. The Romans turned beauty into brutality, proving that even luxury could become an instrument of death. 76. Crushed between doors, used in interrogation. In Rome, even doors could kill. During interrogations, prisoners who refused to speak were placed between two massive wooden panels or gates. Soldiers would slowly push them closer, inch by inch, until ribs cracked and bones splintered under the pressure. It wasn't a quick death. The agony built with every creak of wood. Victims often confessed too late, their lungs already collapsing. The Romans valued information, but they valued dominance more. To be crushed between doors was to feel the empire itself closing in. Unyielding, merciless, absolute. 77. Death by sword dance, surrounded by spinning blades. The sword dance was as artistic as it was lethal. Criminals or condemned men were placed at the center of a circle where performers, often skilled swordsmen or acrobats, would whirl and strike in rhythmic patterns. Each misstep, each breath out of rhythm, could mean a slice across the flesh or a fatal stab. It was both a performance and an execution, Rome's way of turning murder into theater. The crowd cheered as the blades flashed, glinting like firelight. By the end, the dance always ended the same way. One final step, one final cut. 78. Bled dry for ritual, sacrifices to false gods. Before the Christian era, some secret cults and fanatics within Rome practiced sacrifices where victims were drained of blood as offerings to gods or spirits. The process was slow. Veins opened strategically so that life slipped away drop by drop. Priests caught the blood in bowls or poured it over altars, believing it carried divine power. The victim often remained conscious long enough to feel their heartbeat fade. It wasn't just about death. It was about turning a person into a vessel for faith. In Rome, devotion could be as deadly as war. 79. Death by legion punishment, decimation. 1 in 10 soldiers beaten to death. When a Roman legion showed cowardice or rebellion, their commanders used the most terrifying punishment imaginable: decimation. The soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots, and the unlucky one chosen was beaten to death by his 9 comrades. It wasn't done out of hatred, but duty. The message was clear. Fear kept Rome's armies strong. To watch a brother die under your own hand carved loyalty through trauma. Decimation was rare, but its horror lingered for generations. It taught soldiers that in Rome, failure was deadlier than any enemy. 80. Scorched in bronze bull, roasted alive inside a metal statue. The bronze bull was one of the most infamous execution devices ever conceived. A hollow metal statue shaped like a bull, with a hatch on its side. The victim was locked inside, and a fire was lit beneath it. As the metal heated, the body roasted from within. Ingeniously cruel, the bull's mouth was designed to turn screams into the sound of roaring, transforming agony into music for the crowd. Smoke poured from its nostrils like a living beast. This spectacle blended artistry and horror, a symbol of how Rome's taste for power could twist beauty into pure monstrosity. 81. Buried under arena sand, suffocated mid-show. In Rome's grand arenas, even the sand itself could become a weapon. When condemned men lost their fights or displeased the crowd, executioners sometimes buried them alive, right there in the arena floor. The golden sand soaked up blood as shovels piled it over squirming bodies. The audience watched, roaring approval as muffled screams faded beneath the ground. It wasn't just death. It was entertainment, humiliation, and spectacle all at once. The victim's final sight? The blazing sun above and the faces of thousands cheering their last breath into silence. 82. Fed to crocodiles, imported beasts for elite punishments. Romans loved exotic death. In lavish private estates or staged arena games, crocodiles imported from Egypt were used for elite executions. The condemned, often slaves or traitors, were tossed into shallow pools where the reptiles lurked. The attack wasn't instant. Crocodiles stalked first, testing their prey's panic before clamping down with bone-crushing force. The audience adored the tension, savoring every scream as nature devoured man. For Rome's wealthy, this wasn't cruelty. It was status. The more exotic the beast, the more civilized the execution appeared. 83. Death by lava flow, Pompeii. Suffocation and heat. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, thousands met a uniquely Roman fate, not by sword but by nature's fury. The lava didn't kill instantly. Most perished from the scalding ash and suffocating gases. The air turned toxic, lungs burned, and heat baked flesh into charcoal in seconds. Many victims froze in their final poses, praying, covering faces, clutching loved ones. Their plaster casts remain today, eerie echoes of their last breaths. It's one of history's rare moments where even Rome's might bowed to a death greater than empire. 84. Executed by emperor's whim, instant and unpredictable. In Rome, living near power meant living near danger. Some emperors, like Caligula or Nero, treated life as a game of impulse. A joke taken the wrong way, a misplaced glance, or bad timing could mean instant death. Executions by whim were spectacles of ego. One command and a man could be decapitated, burned, or fed to beasts without trial. It wasn't law that ruled, it was mood. In a world where the emperor was God, no reason was needed. The worst part wasn't dying, it was never knowing when your turn would come. 85. Drowned in honey. Suffocation disguised as decadence. Honey, a Roman luxury, could also become a golden tomb. In certain elite punishments or poetic executions, victims were submerged in large vats of honey. The sticky sweetness clung to their skin, filled their lungs, and trapped every desperate gasp for air. Death came slowly, a blend of suffocation, panic, and horror. To outsiders, it looked serene, even beautiful, a man preserved in amber-like stillness. But beneath that glossy surface was pure torment. In Rome, even luxury could kill, a reminder that excess and cruelty often shared the same taste. 86. Dragged behind a chariot, torn apart on the road. To the Romans, a chariot wasn't just for racing, it was also for punishment. Criminals, deserters, or rebels were bound by ropes to the back of a speeding chariot and dragged across stone roads until their bodies were reduced to ruin. Skin ripped away, bones shattered, and dust mixed with blood in a trail that stretched for miles. This death wasn't meant to be swift. It was public theater, a warning that defying Rome meant being ground beneath its wheels. The crowd's cheers followed the chariot like ghosts until nothing human was left behind. 87. Death by salt exposure. Wounds salted to torment. Salt, a Roman symbol of purity and preservation, could also become an instrument of agony. After torture or flogging, wounds were rubbed with coarse salt, sometimes repeatedly, day after day. The sting was unbearable, reopening scabs and inflaming flesh. In severe cases, the condemned were tied up while slaves poured salt water over open cuts until infection set in. What began as burning pain became fever, delirium, and death. For the Romans, salt's purity doubled as cruelty. It preserved food, but destroyed flesh. A painful reminder that Rome's punishments always had flavor. 88. Crushed under statues, symbolic divine judgment. When emperors or gods were angered, some Romans believed the guilty should be punished by their own idols. Condemned men were placed beneath massive stone statues, often of gods or the emperor himself, and then the monument was deliberately toppled onto them. It wasn't just execution, it was symbolism. Being crushed beneath a divine image meant being literally judged by the gods. The sound of cracking bones beneath marble echoed through the temple courtyards. The message was clear. In Rome, even statues could pass sentence. 89. Tossed into snake pits. Classic execution for betrayal. Few deaths terrified Romans more than the snake pit, used for traitors, spies, or those accused of poisoning. The condemned were thrown into deep pits filled with venomous serpents imported from Egypt or Africa. Panic made victims move, and every movement provoked another bite. The poison coursed through their veins, paralyzing and suffocating them from the inside out. The pit itself became a writhing tomb, hissing and alive. The Romans saw this as fitting justice, a traitor devoured by treachery itself. For the spectators, it was horror and fascination entwined. 90. Tortured by iron claws, shredded piece by piece. The iron claws, also called the hooks, were torture tools designed to flay a person alive. The victim was tied to a post while executioners raked the metal claws down their back, chest, and limbs, skin peeled away in strips, muscles exposed, and the screams filled the air like music to the crowd. Some victims survived hours of this before succumbing to shock or blood loss. In Rome, pain was performance, and the claw was its artist. It was a spectacle meant to remind everyone watching that Rome's justice didn't just kill, it unmade you. 91. Burned in tar-coated robes as living torches. In the reign of Nero, Rome's night sky sometimes glowed not with stars, but with people. Victims, often Christians or rebels, were dressed in robes soaked with tar or pitch, tied to poles, and set ablaze to light imperial gardens. The flames clung to their bodies, burning slowly, cruelly. Screams mixed with the crackle of fire as spectators watched, wine in hand. To the Romans, it was illumination. To the condemned, it was agony that lasted minutes before merciful death. These human torches became eternal symbols of Rome's darkest entertainment. 92. Poisoned by mushrooms, the emperor's poison. Mushrooms were delicacies in ancient Rome, especially the deadly kind. Emperor Claudius himself was rumored to have been murdered by a poisoned dish of mushrooms prepared by his wife, Agrippina. The toxins acted slowly, twisting the stomach, clouding the mind, and paralyzing the body. Death came over hours, disguised as sickness. What made it horrific wasn't the violence, but the betrayal. To eat at the emperor's table meant dining with death itself. The Romans joked that mushrooms were the food of the gods, perhaps because they sent so many to meet them. 93. Death by mercury poisoning, used in mining. In Roman silver and gold mines, slaves worked with mercury to separate metals. The shimmering liquid fascinated them until it killed them. Prolonged exposure corroded lungs, blackened gums, and caused madness before death. Some miners collapsed within months, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. Rome didn't waste medicine on slaves, they simply replaced them. Mercury was the silent killer of empire wealth, an invisible executioner that claimed thousands. For Rome's riches, many paid with their minds, their breath, and their humanity. 94. Suffocated by sandbags, slow internal crush. An execution both brutal and deceptively calm. The condemned were tied to the ground while soldiers stacked heavy sandbags on their chests, one after another. Breathing grew harder with every addition. The ribs creaked, the lungs flattened, and eventually the heart gave out. The victim stayed conscious for most of it, gasping in silence. It was often used for soldiers or slaves to make an example without shedding blood. Rome mastered not just how to kill, but how to make the process itself a lesson in control. 95. Executed by nail torture, hammered into body joints. In this method, nails weren't just for crucifixion. They were weapons of torment. The executioners drove iron spikes into the victim's hands, knees, and elbows, one joint at a time. Each blow shattered bone and sent waves of agony through the nerves. Some victims were nailed to walls or doors, left to die standing. Others were finished slowly, each nail a deliberate punctuation of pain. For the Romans, it wasn't enough to end a life. They wanted to write suffering into the body itself. 96. Burned in the amphitheater, spectacle before crowds. In the great arenas, fire was both a tool and entertainment. Criminals and prisoners were tied to stakes, surrounded by piles of dry wood, and set ablaze before tens of thousands. The flames reflected off marble seats as the crowd cheered. Some were coated in oil for a longer burn. Others paired with wild beasts already on fire. The amphitheater turned execution into performance art. Rome's version of reality theater, where every death was applause-worthy. Mercy was not in the script. 97, tied under a rampaging bull, crushed and gored. In some provinces, condemned men were tied beneath an enraged bull, its horns sharpened, its body driven into a frenzy with fire or spears. As the beast thrashed, the body beneath was torn apart by hooves and horns, bones snapping under the weight. It wasn't just execution, it was symbolism, being trampled by the strength of the gods or empire itself. The crowd roared with each strike, a grotesque celebration of power and punishment intertwined. Few deaths were more chaotic or more Roman. 98. Death by overfeeding, forced eating till organs ruptured. Gluttony as execution, Rome's twisted sense of irony. Some prisoners were force-fed endless amounts of food and drink, often rich meats and milk, until their stomachs ruptured or their hearts stopped. What began as a mock feast ended in agony. The body, overwhelmed, rebelled from within. It was a death reserved for those accused of greed or betrayal, a punishment wrapped in indulgence. To die by excess was the ultimate Roman statement. Luxury itself could kill as cruelly as any sword. 99. Crucified upside down, prolonged and humiliating. Crucifixion was already a nightmare, but upside down it became worse. The blood rushed to the head, vision blurred, and breathing grew impossible over time. Muscles tore as the body's weight shifted unnaturally. According to tradition, St. Peter chose this form out of humility, not wanting to die like Christ. But for others it was pure torment. Hours stretched into days. The Romans made sure the world saw crucifixion not just as death, but as a warning etched against the skyline. 100 executed for fun by Caligula. Random, senseless imperial cruelty. Emperor Caligula's reign was terror dressed as comedy. He executed people not for crimes, but for amusement, ordering deaths during dinners, games, or out of sheer boredom. A noble might die for a joke that fell flat. A soldier for sneezing in his presence. Caligula once said, "I wish all Rome had one neck so I could cut it at once." His executions weren't justice, they were theater, a god-king's playground of madness. Under his rule, every Roman learned one truth. Survival depended not on loyalty, but on luck. And there you have it. 100 of the worst, most horrifying ways to die in the ancient Roman world. A civilization remembered for its power, its art, and its law, but also for its cruelty. To them, death wasn't just punishment. It was theater. Every scream echoed through marble halls, every execution a reminder that mercy was rare and pain was public. But from those ashes, Rome left us a truth that still lingers today. Greatness built on suffering never lasts. The empire fell, but the stories and the warnings remain. So, if you made it this far, you've survived the Colosseum of history. This has been 100 Ways in a Nutshell. If you want to see how brutal history can really get, don't forget to subscribe before the next empire burns.